Chapter 1. June in St. Hedwig's brought roses climbing, curling, spilling across trellises and porch rails, like gossip, eager to be heard. The village was basking under a sleepy sun, and the dower house, perched just off the green, with ivy climbing its aged stone walls, looked the very picture of tranquillity. Miss Marple had received her invitation by handwritten note that morning. Lavender ink. Careful cursive. Do join us for tea in the garden at 4. It would be a pleasure. C. Everley. Cordelia Everley, the widow of Major Thomas Everley, was a woman with a spine of steel and a tongue dipped in Devonshire cream. Sweet to hear, sharp if you weren't listening properly. The dower house had been hers since the Major passed a decade ago. Her station secured, her company carefully selected. Tea in the garden was her specialty. Miss Marple arrived just before the clock struck 4. And maid, new, judging by her uncertain curtsy, led her out past the house into the manicured garden, where linen-covered tables gleamed, and mismatched porcelain cups caught the light. Cordelia, in a pale lavender dress, presided like a queen among hydrangeas. Edwin Peake, the village's new physician, charming, single, and visibly unused to Cordelia's social chess. Mrs. Fiona Hargrave, who lived down the lane and had the exact look of someone always on the brink of sharing a secret. Reverend Silas Merton, solemn, sunburned, and frequently flustered by Mrs. Hargrave's irreverent jokes. And Estelle Ederley, Cordelia's niece, all of 24, and impossibly fragile, with a habit of apologizing before speaking. Miss Marple's chair had been placed carefully, half-shaded, downwind of the honeysuckle. Cordelia believed in comfort, if not warmth. "I do hope the scones are edible," Cordelia said with a practiced sigh as the plates were passed. "Cook's new girl is terribly nervous. Still, we must give the young a chance. Nothing a bit of strawberry jam can't fix," Miss Marple said kindly, accepting hers. Estelle's hands trembled slightly as she poured the tea. "She's always nervous around company," Cordelia said fondly, though there was a flicker of impatience in her smile. "So sensitive, poor lamb. Her mother was just the same, died too young." A sparrow flitted through the hedge. "I've never seen so many bees," Mrs. Hargrave muttered, fanning herself. "There's a swarm somewhere in the orchard. I swear it." Dr. Peake, leaning forward, smiled at Estelle. "You seem a bit flushed, Miss Everley." "Perhaps a touch too much sun." Estelle gave a wan smile. I'm all right. Just tired, perhaps. I said to her earlier." Cordelia interjected. "She needs meat. For girls practically translucent." Miss Marple observed all this with quiet interest. Nothing odd, precisely. Only a curious tension to the air, the kind of tension one noticed when lace had been too tightly starched, something too perfect, too staged. The tea passed pleasantly enough, with murmurs about the upcoming village fete, the cost of strawberries this season, and the mysterious new lodger in the vicarage's side cottage. It wasn't until just before 6, when chairs were being pushed back and cordial farewells exchanged, that the incident occurred. Cordelia Everley, having risen to see her guests off, wavered suddenly on her feet. "Oh!" she staggered. Estelle caught her elbow. "Aunt Cordelia." The teacup slipped from her hand and shattered. Cordelia made a low sound in her throat. Her lips moved, just once, but no one could make out the word. Then she collapsed in a rustle of silk and sun hat, the trailing lavender hem catching on a rosebush. Dr. Peake rushed to her side. "Let her lie still," he said, eyes already calculating. "Mrs. Hargrave, fetch cold water." But Miss Marple had already moved to Cordelia's other side. She placed 2 fingers gently at her neck. "Her pulse is gone," she said softly. A scream. Estelle's cut through the garden. And just like that, the calm was gone. The bees buzzed. The scones sat half-eaten, and the dower house's tea party dissolved into tragedy. Miss Marple rose slowly, brushing her skirt. Her eyes lingered on the broken teacup. Not an accident. Not entirely. Something was wrong. Not the kind of wrong that made itself loudly known, but the quieter, deeper kind. She bent to pick up a fragment of porcelain. There was a faint trace of something on the rim. Something too dark for tea alone. Chapter 2. By the time the ambulance arrived from Market Ledbury, Cordelia Everleigh's body had been respectfully covered with a monogrammed linen cloth, and the guests had drifted into stunned silence beneath the rose arbor. Miss Marple sat apart from the others on a low bench near the trellis, her hands calmly folded around her handbag. She wasn't praying, nor was she grieving, not yet. She was thinking, quietly, thoroughly, and with that peculiar discipline of mind that allowed her to recall, in crisp detail, the precise order in which the tea had been poured. Dr. Peake spoke first. No sign of trauma. She just dropped. It could be the heart, or a stroke. His tone was professional, but a faint edge of something defensiveness perhaps lurked beneath. Miss Marple gave a gentle nod. She was robust for her age, certainly active. She played croquet only last Tuesday, and quite viciously. Estelle, still pale, sat rigid at the garden table, untouched tea cooling beside her. She blinked rapidly, hands clasped too tightly in her lap. "She didn't seem unwell this morning," she whispered. She was her usual self. Mrs. Hargrave sniffed audibly. "Mark my words." She kept complaining about the glare and the bees. Perhaps she had an allergy. Some people swell right up, you know. Reverend Merton looked uncomfortable. "Let's not speculate. The Lord will reveal what is meant to be known." Miss Marple looked at him with polite interest, but said nothing. It was not her way to correct clergymen. The constable, a young man named Rafferty, with a nervous moustache, had arrived along with the ambulance. He spoke with quiet uncertainty. "Dr. Peake, you'll need to record the time of death." "About 6:04 by my watch," the doctor said, not quite meeting anyone's eyes. "And you'll provide a cause." "For now, natural causes. We'll need the—" "And you'll provide a cause." "For now, natural causes. We'll need the coroner, of course." Miss Marple's gaze drifted to the linen cloth again. Cordelia's hat, oddly untouched by the fall, sat like a pale crown nearby the grass. Beside it, the broken porcelain cup glinted where the tea had spilled, still slightly steaming, its rim stained with a shade too dark to be milked Darjeeling. Rafferty turned toward her, with an awkward cough. "Miss Marple, you were sitting beside her?" "Yes." "You saw it happen?" "I did," she replied. "She rose to see us off. She wavered. She fell." "No complaints beforehand?" Miss Marple considered. "Not explicitly. But Cordelia was not a woman who admitted to weakness." Estelle's voice quivered. She said, "The scones were heavy. I didn't think anything of it." She was always critical. "Did she eat them?" "No, just half, and 2 cups of tea." Miss Marple turned her head slightly. "She drank from the cup you poured?" Estelle nodded, as though ashamed. "Yes, I poured all the tea. I didn't know." "No one is blaming you, my dear." Miss Marple said softly. But Mrs. Hargrave had already leaned forward. Still, it's odd, isn't it? If it was the tea, or something in it, then surely we'd all be unwell. Not necessarily, Miss Marple said. Only one cup was broken. The implication hovered. I'll take the crockery, if you don't mind, Dr. Peake said quickly. Just in case, I can send samples to the coroner's lab in Ledbury. Standard procedure. Constable Rafferty hesitated, then nodded. Yes, quite right. Mrs. Hargrave snorted softly. Seems very thorough. All of a sudden, Dr. Peake flushed. Just doing what's proper, Mrs. Hargrave. There was a tension to his shoulders that hadn't been there when tea was poured. Miss Marple noted it. Later that evening, back in her cottage with its rosebud chintz and ticking clock, Miss Marple reviewed the day's events, not with drama but with the same steadiness she applied to her knitting. Cordelia Everleigh had been in command of every detail, from her guest list to her table settings to her niece's posture. She had run the Dower House like a ship with rules, duties, and invisible lines that one did not cross. And yet, someone had crossed one. If Cordelia had indeed been poisoned, and Miss Marple felt certain she had, it had been done subtly, not with theatrics but with precision. Not everyone would know how or why, but someone had. She considered each guest. Mrs. Hargrave had a tongue too quick, and eyes that missed nothing. Gossip was her element. But murder, it seemed theatrical for her. Reverend Norton, quiet, repressed, and always vaguely embarrassed. He might hide a personal failure, a secret sin, but poison. No. Dr. Peake, professional, courteous, perhaps too quick to take charge. Estelle, fragile, fawn-like Estelle. She had poured the tea, yes, but Miss Marple had seen her hands. Shaking, nervous, but not guilty, not intentionally. No, the answer wasn't in the tea alone. It was in the structure of the afternoon. Miss Marple stood, her joints complaining faintly, and fetched her diary. She turned to today's page and began to write. Tea at Dower House. Guest list. C.E. Host. E. Niece. Dr. E.P. Mrs. F.H. Reverend S.M. Self. Order of events. Arrival. 3:56. Tea served. 4:05. Scones. Criticized. Conversation. Mostly mundane. Bees noted by F.H. Cordelia. Stood approx. 6:03. Collapse. Teacup. Broken. Stain. Observed on Rin. Dr. P. Removed evidence. Estelle. Emotional. Constable. Uncertain. She paused. Then, in a separate line, she wrote, Cordelia mentioned giving the young a chance. Who, exactly? A question, a clue, not to be overvalued, but also never dismissed. And in her experience, a murder that looks like a fainting spell is rarely a coincidence. Chapter 3. The next morning, the village of St. Hedwig's awoke to the scent of damp roses and the faint unease that follows a death too sudden for comfort. The sun rose over shuttered windows, curtains half drawn, not in mourning, but in curiosity. By 10 o'clock, the post office had already become a hub of muted speculation. Collapsed, they say, muttered Mr. Toller, folding a newspaper he hadn't finished reading. Right in her garden, poor lady. Tea still in her hand. She wasn't that old, countered Mrs. Blythe, who hadn't been invited, and would not forget it. 69, maybe 70. Fit as a fiddle. if a touch too proud of her rosebeds. Miss Marple, who was buying a single stamp for a letter she had no urgent need to send, listened without interruption. She tucked the stamp into her handbag, offered a polite smile, and stepped back out into the morning air. She did not head home. Instead, she walked down a narrow lane that turned near the butcher's, past the library, and curved behind the church toward the vicarage. At the far end of its tidy gravel path sat a small side cottage, whitewashed and shy, with a lavender bush pressed against the window. According to Mrs. Hargrave, it had recently acquired a tenant. Miss Marple approached the door and knocked gently. It was opened by a woman in her mid-30s, dressed in a grey cardigan and skirt, respectable but unobtrusive. Her dark hair was pinned with quiet care, and her eyes behind rimless glasses held a guarded watchfulness. "Yes," the woman said, not unfriendly, but not inviting either. "I do beg your pardon," Miss Marple said cheerfully. "I'm Miss Marple, Jane Marple, from the High Street. I believe you've taken the vicarage's side cottage." The woman hesitated. "Yes, I moved in last week. I'm Eleanor Carter. A very peaceful little place. I used to know the woman who lived here before, Mrs. Allerton. She kept cats. Too many, I'm afraid. I hope the scent hasn't lingered." "Not noticeably." "Good. I do hope you're settling in." "I am, though it seems the village isn't as peaceful as I expected. Poor Mrs. Everleigh. Quite sudden." Eleanor Carter's expression flickered. "I'd only met her briefly." Sudden. Eleanor Carter's expression flickered. "I'd only met her briefly. At the grocer's." She seemed precise. "An accurate word," Miss Marple said gently. "Did you know her niece Estelle?" "No, though I saw her at church last Sunday. She looked quite lost." There was nothing in the tone but observation. Still, Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Well, I won't keep you. Just neighborly curiosity. We're always hopeful when new people arrive. Fresh eyes see more than tired ones." Miss Carter inclined her head. "Some things, perhaps." Miss Marple left with a parting nod, her interest neither satisfied nor discouraged. At the Dower house, the curtains had not been drawn back. Estelle Everleigh sat alone at the breakfast table, untouched toast before her, the tea tepid. Her eyes were red, but she had not wept. Not exactly. Across from her sat a man with close-cropped hair, neat cuffs, and a voice so precise it could slice paper. "Mr. Basil Leighton's solicitor." "Cordelia's." "I've contacted the coroner," he said. "A preliminary examination will occur tomorrow morning. Until then, nothing can be formally certified." Estelle nodded. "I've also reviewed the will. Your aunt last amended it 5 months ago." Another nod. "You are the primary beneficiary, as you likely expected. The house, the contents, and a modest annuity. The rest is allocated to 3 charities, and there is a bequest to Mrs. Hargrave, £25 annually, for service to the Rose Society." Estelle blinked. She hated Mrs. Hargrave. Mr. Leighton allowed a slim smile. She did, but she was scrupulously fair. "There will, I expect, be objections, particularly from Mr. Forbes." Estelle frowned. "I don't know a Mr. Forbes." "No, an investment advisor. Her accountant says he was employed briefly to review the trust holdings last year. She dismissed him in January." Estelle looked down at her untouched toast. "She never mentioned him." "Perhaps there's a reason. Either way, Miss Everleigh, I advise discretion in the coming days. With sudden deaths come sudden inquiries." Estelle looked up slowly. "You think she was murdered?" Leighton didn't answer. Instead, he rose, buttoned his coat, and said, My job is not to speculate, Miss Everly, but I've learned that money does not die quietly. Good morning. Outside, Leighton passed Miss Marple by the garden gate. She nodded politely. I hope you're not delivering bad news. Only the legal kind. Ah, I suppose legal news is never entirely innocent. Leighton offered a dry smile. Like poison, Miss Marple, sometimes tasteless, until it's too late. He departed. Miss Marple stepped through the garden path. The table from yesterday had been cleared, the broken cup gone, but the space still held an echo. She could feel it, faint but certain, like the last note of a chord still humming beneath silence. She found Estelle in the doorway, arms crossed tightly. I didn't sleep, Estelle murmured. I kept hearing the teacup break, over and over. Grief does that, Miss Marple said kindly. It repeats what can't be undone. Estelle's eyes grinned with something raw. They think I did it. Do you think you did? Estelle flinched. I poured the tea. Many people pour tea. Fewer understand motive, or opportunity, or timing. But if it was poison, then I must have. Miss Marple took her hand gently. My dear, guilt is not logic, and logic, if we're careful with it, will free you from both. Estelle's fingers curled slightly around Miss Marple's. They'll come for the will, she said softly. They'll say I wanted the house, the money, but I didn't. No, Miss Marple agreed, but someone else might have. Chapter 4. The coroner arrived at midday, his manner clipped, his questions procedural. Estelle remained indoors. Peake accompanied the examination with clinical detachment, offering precise timings and professional terms. The death certificate would not be issued until toxicology reports returned. Until then, the word suspicious remained unspoken, but heavily implied. By afternoon, the Dower House's garden had been cleared of yesterday's charm. The furniture was returned indoors. The broken porcelain swept away. Only the bees lingered, confused and agitated, around the lilacs. Miss Marple took tea, not in her parlour, but with an old friend, Mrs. Lavinia Winthrop, a former headmistress who knew everything about everyone, if not always accurately. She had an enemy, you know, Lavinia whispered, slicing into a currant bun. Everyone thought Cordelia was so respectable, but really, she'd burned a few bridges. Miss Marple stirred her tea without looking up. The gardener, young Jasper, dismissed last month, said she accused him of stealing gloves. Gloves, mind you. Was it proven? No one proved anything, but she sent him off, without a reference. Lusty business. And he's not right in the head. Poor boy, lives with that father of his, who drinks like a sailor and shouts at clouds. Miss Marple nodded slightly. Gloves are rather a curious thing to steal. Small, intimate. Well, Cordelia was always odd about her possessions. Remember that piano stool she locked with a chain? I do. Miss Marple didn't press further. Instead, she quietly pocketed the name Jasper Gough, tucking it away for later. Later that day, Constable Rafferty appeared at Miss Marple's gate, hat in hand, and dust on his boots. He looked as if he'd walked a moral mile and wasn't sure he'd arrived. Just for a moment. Of course, Mr. Rafferty. The geraniums won't mind the delay. He hesitated on the threshold of her cottage. I've got a question, or maybe more, a worry. Sit, please. He did, perching on the edge of the armchair like a schoolboy summoned by the headmistress. It's the teacup, he began. Dr. Peake said he'd submit it for analysis, but when I went to follow up, he said it had already been sent off by courier. Rather fast, isn't it? Curious. Miss Marple agreed mildly. Very efficient, or very eager. Exactly. He seemed off. Agitated. I don't want to think poorly of him. He's the doctor, but something about how quickly he took control. It nags at me. As it should, Miss Marple said softly. You have good instincts, Constable. Use them. He flushed. Do you think he had something to hide? I think everyone has something to hide. The question is what, and whether it matters. Rafferty nodded. There's something else. Yes, a letter. Found on Cordelia's writing desk. Unsent, but addressed. To a Mr. Emery Forbes. To a Mr. Emery Forbes. That name mean anything to you? Miss Marple's eyes lit with quiet focus. Yes, her solicitor mentioned it. An investment advisor. Letter says she'd reconsidered something. That she wanted to reverse last autumn's decision, and was prepared to reopen their discussions. Bit formal for a personal note. May I see it? Rafferty passed it over. The paper smelled faintly of lavender and ink. Miss Marple read silently. Dear Mr. Forbes, after due thought, I believe I may have acted in haste last October. Your recommendations, though unusual, have proven sound in hindsight. I would like to resume our arrangement. With discretion, please do not respond by post. I will be in touch with particulars soon. Cordelia Everly, she never sent it? Miss Marple asked. Low stamp. Tucked in the drawer. Written by my guess. 2 or 3 days ago. Miss Marple considered. Discretion. Financial reversal. Timing. And now she's dead. It's odd, isn't it? It's potential, Miss Marple said. Potential for motive. We must learn who Mr. Forbes is, and why she dismissed him in the first place. That evening, Estelle wandered the house restlessly, her footsteps muffled on Persian rugs. The silence was thick, not just with grief, but the ghost of Cordelia's order. The drawing-room still smelled of her perfume. Estelle passed through the study, intending only to retrieve a novel, but paused at the writing desk. She stared at the chair, then opened a lower drawer, unsure why. Inside was a small leather-bound ledger. She frowned. Cordelia didn't leave books lying about. Certainly not ledgers. The first page was dated 8 months ago. A guest revised allocation of income from Rutland Trust. Estelle's allowance reduced, no notice to be given. Redirected to discretionary development account. Handled by E. Estelle's throat tightened. Flipping further, she saw notes, references to shares, disbursements, and figures she didn't fully understand. But her name appeared more than once, always in connection with deductions. Then, a final line. December, remove all references to Estelle's funds prior to annual audit. E.F. to handle. She closed the book with shaking hands. E.F. Forbes. That had to be him. But why was her allowance touched? Cordelia had always said she was saving it for a proper future. Estelle took the ledger upstairs, wrapped it in a shawl, and hid it beneath a floorboard in her closet. She didn't know who to trust. Not yet. But she was beginning to understand something she hadn't dared consider. Someone had been stealing from Cordelia, and someone didn't want her to find out. Chapter 5. Miss Marple had always believed that the quietest places often held the loudest secrets. The next morning, as mist lifted off the hedgerows and the church bell struck 8, she penned a single name onto the top line of her notepad. Emery Forbes. She had already visited the village archives once before, when the former schoolmaster was discovered to have faked his war medals. Now she returned, scarf tucked neatly into her coat, to the tiny, seldom-used room above the old town hall, where records gathered dust and secrets went to sleep. She did not expect much, which was why the result surprised her. The name Forbes Emery did not appear in the local registry, nor in the voting records, nor the telephone listings. In fact, the only place it surfaced was on a single typed memorandum dated October 3rd, sent from Everley Holdings, listing a meeting between Mrs. Cordelia Everley and a financial advisor, introduced by external party. B. Later. Basil Later, the solicitor. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed slightly. Back at the Dower House, Estelle had dressed in blue, neat, modest, too stiff for comfort. She was expecting someone, though she hadn't said who. The knock came just after 10. She answered it herself. The man who entered was neither tall nor short, but his presence filled the foyer. His suit was city-tailored, his shoes polished. He looked around as if assessing the value of every object he passed. "Miss Everley?" he asked. "Yes. Emery Forbes. I believe your aunt and I had financial dealings. I was summoned regarding some estate matters." Estelle hesitated. "I wasn't told you were coming. Mr. Layton sent word." A lie. Layton had said nothing, but Estelle stepped aside. "You'd better come in." He walked past her like someone who already owned the place. Miss Marple, unaware of the visit, but not idle, took the liberty of speaking to Mr. Basil Layton again. That afternoon, she found him outside his law office, stepping into his Bentley. "Layton," she called gently. "Forgive the intrusion." He paused. "Miss Marple, something I can assist you with." "I just wondered, how well did you know Mr. Emery Forbes?" Layton straightened. "I recommended him once." "Yes, he was presented to me through a London colleague. Claimed extensive experience in managing estates discreetly. Cordelia consulted him for about 4 months, then let him go." "And why was that?" Layton's brow furrowed. "She never gave a specific reason, simply said his methods were no longer aligned with her needs. I respected that." "Did she suspect mismanagement?" "She was meticulous. If she suspected theft, she would have said, unless she wasn't sure." Layton studied her. "Why the sudden interest?" Miss Marple smiled lightly. "Murder does make one curious." Inside the Dower House, Estelle sat across from Forbes in the drawing room. The man's voice was smooth, self-assured. "I'm here to ensure all records of our transactions are accounted for," he said. "Cordelia had some remaining interests that, per our agreement, require verification." "I wasn't aware of any remaining interests," Estelle said carefully. Forbes tilted his head. "She intended to resume our arrangement. I have her note, if you like." He produced it. A copy, not the original. Identical wording to the letter Estelle had seen yesterday, but printed on clean, crisp paper. No scent of lavender, no ink blots. Estelle said nothing, but her eyes narrowed just slightly. Forbes returned the letter to his folder. Cordelia was not the type to act without forethought. She valued discretion, loyalty, and subtlety. There was something behind those words. A test, a suggestion. "I'm sure she did," Estelle said, her voice level. "Though it seems those qualities weren't always returned." Forbes offered a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Perhaps not. Still, one does what one must." He rose then, smooth as silk. "You'll be hearing from my firm. Kindly ensure nothing is misplaced in the meantime." When he left, Estelle sat very still. She waited until the door clicked shut before running upstairs. She retrieved the ledger from beneath the floorboard, and for the first time, she began to understand that someone had not only lied to her aunt, they were now trying to erase what her aunt had begun to uncover. That evening, Miss Marple received a visit from Constable Rafferty. "Found something strange," he said, glancing nervously at her cat as it padded across the rug. "Said Cordelia's solicitor Leighton, his bank records show 3 large transfers last year. Not to her account. To one registered to a shell firm." Miss Marple asked, her eyebrows rising. "Name means nothing, just a number. But the funny thing, the recipient listed for the transfer is E.F. Associates. Same initials. No physical address, no office, and yet somehow very real." "Very?" I asked Leighton. He got defensive, said it was a standard investment vehicle. People do love words that conceal more than they reveal. "There's more. Leighton and Forbes met in person 3 times before Cordelia ever did. They weren't just acquaintances, they were partners." Miss Marple folded her hands. "And now Cordelia's dead." Just when she began to reconsider that arrangement, Rafferty nodded. Miss Marple rose from her chair and crossed to her desk. She pulled out the small diary she'd been using to track events. Next to Cordelia's death, she drew a thin line. Then she added 2 names beneath it. E. Forbes. Discretion. Theft. Fabrication. B. Leighton. Access. Money. Motive. She tapped the pencil against the page. They believed her to be predictable. But what they underestimated, she said softly, was how quietly a woman like Cordelia could change her mind. Chapter 6. Rain arrived by morning. Light at first, then persistent, soaking the hedges, streaking the dower house windows in steady rivulets. The world had grown quieter beneath the weight of wet earth, as if holding its breath. Miss Marple liked the rain. It kept people indoors. It made them reflective. And, most importantly, it kept certain secrets closer to the surface, where someone observant might spot them wriggling to be free. She waited until 9:30 before knocking at the kitchen entrance of the dower house, where she suspected the young maid, Ivy Curnow, would be sorting breakfast dishes. She was. Miss Marple. Ivy blinked in surprise, clutching a tea towel. "Oh, I wasn't expecting anyone. I won't keep you long," Miss Marple said kindly. "Just a few moments of your time." Ivy hesitated, then led her inside, where the warmth of the oven met the damp scent of bleach. The girl was no more than 17, with freckles, soft hands, and the guarded expression of someone unused to being asked anything but orders. Miss Marple sat at the edge of the kitchen table. "You were serving at the garden tea, were you not?" "I brought the scones and set the cups." "Yes. And you saw who drank what?" "I think so, ma'am. Did you notice anything odd? A moment out of place, perhaps?" Ivy twisted the towel. "Well, there was something. Just before tea, I was fetching the sugar bowl from the pantry. Mrs. Everleigh was particular about her lumps, and I saw Dr. Peake in the kitchen. Said he was looking for the loo, but he was near the teacups." Miss Marple's voice remained gentle. "Near them how?" "Looked like he was checking something. But when I came in, he stepped back real quick. Looked a bit flushed." "Hugh told no one. I didn't want to be rude. He's the doctor." "Of course." Miss Marple smiled, stood and touched the girl's arm lightly. "You've been very helpful, Ivy, and very brave." That same hour, in the solicitor's office, Mr. Basil Leighton burned a letter. Not dramatically, not with trembling hands. Just a match struck, a page folded, the slow curl of flame in the metal ashtray. The letter had arrived that morning, keen signed, typed, a single line. She found the ledger. The girl knows. Leighton leaned back in his chair, smoke curling behind him. If Estelle had the ledger, then time was shorter than he'd hoped. Back at the Dower house, Estelle stood at the window of Cordelia's old bedroom. She'd avoided the room until now, but something had drawn her in. Curiosity, perhaps, or the strange magnetism of grief. When it seeks proof of absence, she opened the wardrobe slowly. Rows of neatly hung garments greeted her. Pastel blouses, a mothball-scented shawl, and the lavender dress Cordelia had worn to the tea. It had been cleaned, returned, and hung without ceremony. Then she noticed the narrow wooden shelf at the back, hidden behind a loose flap of lining. Inside, folded carefully, was a thin sheaf of paper, not handwritten, typed. Estelle drew it out. Memorandum. Private from F. Associates to C. Everly Ray. Rare location of domestic holdings per agreement. Funds withdrawn from Legacy Trust have been repositioned through secure channels. Disclosure is not advised at this time. Should further inquiries arise, we recommend attributing changes to market restructuring or discretionary relocation. Burn upon review. Estelle read it twice, then a third time. But her agreement. They'd taken her inheritance, and Cordelia had agreed. No, that wasn't possible. Not unless she hadn't known what she was signing. Estelle turned abruptly, heart hammering. She had to speak with someone. Someone who could help make sense of this. Miss Marple, meanwhile, had set her course for Dr. Peake's surgery. The small office situated beside the apothecary was quiet. Inside, a tidy receptionist greeted her with faint surprise. "Peake is in with a patient." "I'll wait," Miss Marple said, easing herself into a worn leather chair. When he emerged 10 minutes later, he stopped short at the sight of her. "Miss Marple, is something the matter?" She rose. "Yes, doctor. I'd like to speak to you, not as a patient, but as a witness." He hesitated, then gestured toward the examination room. "Please." Once inside, she turned to face him, hands folded. "You were in the kitchen of the Dower house before tea." His eyes flickered, briefly. "Yes, looking for the washroom. But the washroom is clearly marked near the back door." Peake's jaw tightened. "Miss Marple, what exactly are you implying?" "I imply nothing. I merely observe that you had opportunity, and according to young Ivy, proximity." He stepped forward, voice low. Cordelia was difficult, controlling. She hinted more than once she'd interfere with my practice, suggest she knew things. And what things might those be? Peake paused. "My credentials aren't forged, if that's what you're thinking. But I was dismissed from my last post, quietly. Misdiagnosis of a senior patient. She survived, but her family caused a stir. And Cordelia found out. She always found out. She warned me. A man with mistakes should tread lightly." Miss Marple tilted her head. "So you treaded lightly near her teacup?" "I did no such thing." His voice sharpened. "She was a difficult woman, yes, but I didn't kill her." Miss Marple held his gaze. "Let's hope the autopsy agrees." That evening, as thunder rolled faintly across the downs, Estelle arrived at Miss Marple's cottage. She held out the paper. "She knew," she whispered, "about the money, about everything. They stole it from her, and from me." Miss Marple took the memorandum and read it carefully. When she looked up, her voice was quiet. "Then the murder wasn't just personal, my dear. It was preventative." Chapter 7. By the next morning the rain had cleared, leaving the cobblestones of St. Hedwig's slick, and gleaming under a pale sky. There was a hush about the village, the kind that lingered after gossip had turned into something sharper, something accusatory. Inside her cottage, Miss Marple laid the typed memorandum beside the ledger Estelle had delivered. She wore her glasses low on her nose, the way she did when reading not just words, but implications. Two separate threads, one financial, the other fatal, both wound around the same name. E.F.'s Associates, a company without an address, some man with no history, and a solicitor who burned correspondence without blinking. Miss Marple traced her fingertip along the handwritten annotations in the ledger. Cordelia's handwriting was tiny but assertive. It had begun with mundane notations, dates, values, dividends, but then shifted. There were question marks beside certain figures. A few entries had been crossed out in red. One stood out. Large consultation with E.F. read Estelle's annuity. Reduction not disclosed to E.E. Must amend. That word, amend. Cordelia had planned to fix it. Miss Marple sat back, folding her hands. The motive was no longer murky. It was naff. Greed, disguised as advice, presented as strategy. But murder had still required opportunity, and nerve, and perhaps something else, panic. Estelle remained inside the Daer house that morning, keeping to the upstairs rooms. She hadn't spoken with Leighton since discovering the memorandum, nor had she answered Forbes' thinly veiled request for a second meeting. She didn't feel safe. Her nerves were raw, yet sharper than they'd ever been. Fear had made her vigilant, and vigilance had made her realize something odd. Cordelia's writing desk, where the unsent letter had been found, had always been locked, but when Estelle first opened it, the drawer had slid open without resistance. Cordelia had never left it that way. Not once. Someone had gone through it after her death. Someone looking for that letter, or the ledger, or both. Constable Rafferty, meanwhile, had finally received a response to his background request on Emery Forbes, or, rather, the man using that name. Alias, he told Miss Marple that afternoon, glancing around to ensure they weren't overheard. Real name, Henry Felix Crowe. Disbarred accountant. Fraud charges. Served time in 1952. Changed names twice since. Crowe, Miss Marple repeated softly. An apt choice. Carrion comes after what's already dead. Rafferty looked grim. He moves from estate to estate, targets older women with complex holdings, always uses a shell firm. If they catch on, he vanishes. And this time, Miss Marple said, he didn't vanish quickly enough. No, and Cordelia Everly may have been the first to realize it. Rafferty paused, then added, Forbes, Crowe, left the village this morning. Miss Marple looked up. How convenient, he said. He had business in Ledbury, gave an address that doesn't exist. We only found that out after he'd already gone. Miss Marple tapped her cane lightly against the ground. Then we must assume he knows Estelle found the ledger. Rafferty frowned. Do you think he'll come back? Men like Mr. Crowe always come back, especially when they've left something behind. They can't afford to be discovered. That evening, Estelle found a note slid under the front door. It wasn't signed, but she recognized the style, dry, precise, economical with words. We should talk. You don't understand the full situation. Come alone. 8 p.m. Warblers Lane. Behind the old well. Estelle read it 3 times. She thought of tearing it up, burning it, ignoring it. But instead, she folded it and put it in her coat pocket. At exactly 10 minutes past 7, Miss Marple arrived at the Daer house unannounced. Estelle answered the door looking drawn, her coat already on. "Going somewhere?" Miss Marple asked pleasantly. "I just needed air. Perhaps I'll walk with you." Estelle hesitated. "I don't think." Miss Marple's gaze held hers. "You received a note." Estelle said nothing. "I thought so," Miss Marple continued gently. "He's trying to lure you into silence, or fear, or both. I have to know what he meant." "No," Miss Marple said, her voice quiet, but steely. "We have to know, and not on his terms." Estelle's hand moved slowly toward her pocket. Miss Marple extended hers. The girl placed the note into it. Miss Marple read it, nodded once, then said, "You won't be going." Estelle's eyes widened. "But if I don't, he'll think you came." At 8 p.m., Warbler's Lane was silent, except for the whisper of branches in the breeze. Behind the old well, the ground sloped slightly, soft with moss. The figure who approached was careful, methodical. He wore gloves. He carried something in his coat, small, metallic, precise. But when he stepped past the oak tree, "Stop where you are," came Constable Rafferty's voice, low but firm. From the shadows, 2 officers stepped forward. The man froze. No sudden movement, no denial, only a slow, bitter smile. "Clever," he said softly. "Didn't think the girl had it in her." "She didn't," Miss Marple said, emerging behind him. "But I did." Back at her cottage that night, Miss Marple poured herself a small glass of sherry. She didn't raise it in triumph, nor sigh in relief. She merely sat beside the ticking clock and watched the condensation fade from the window pane. There was still one piece missing. Forbes or Crowe had not acted alone. Someone else had known Cordelia was about to amend her financial plans. Someone local, someone trusted, and that someone had provided Crowe not only access, but timing. The poison in the cup had not come from afar. It had come from someone already inside the garden. Chapter 8. News of Emery Forbes' arrest, or Henry Crowe, as the constable now properly called him, spread through St. Hedwig's by the next morning like steam through a kettle. Most villagers knew only that the man was not who he said he was. That was enough for the gossip to boil. But Miss Marple, seated at her breakfast table with a pot of black-currant jam and a copy of the Daily Telegraph, knew what still lingered unspoken. Crowe may have orchestrated the fraud, but he had not acted alone in murder. The poison had been placed with precision and timing, and knowledge of where Cordelia would sit, who would pour for her. And when the moment would come, Crowe had not been at the garden table that day. Someone else had arranged for his silence to take effect before he could be exposed. And Miss Marple knew exactly where to look next. The law offices of Basildon were quiet at 11 o'clock when Miss Marple entered. The receptionist gave her a wary glance, but offered no protest. The solicitor was alone in his study, window open, eyes on the thin manila file. When he saw her, he stood slowly. "Miss Marple, I didn't expect a visit this morning. No one ever does. But sometimes that's when the truth slips through the curtain." He gave a stiff smile. "You always speak like that, like there's a second meaning in every sentence." "There usually is." He gestured toward a chair. "To what do I owe the honor?" "Cordelia's final instructions." and the question of who precisely provided Henry Crowe with access to her financial documentation. Leighton's brow furrowed. You think I know you recommended him. I know you transferred funds through a shell firm. I know Cordelia changed her mind. Perhaps not publicly, but enough to write a letter. She opened her handbag and produced the typed memorandum. This was hidden in Cordelia's wardrobe. I believe she received it shortly before her death. Leighton took the page slowly. Read. Folded it once. She shouldn't have kept that. No, but it suggests she was preparing to expose something. Leighton looked up. So you believe I poisoned her? Miss Marple didn't answer directly. I believe she was poisoned, and the person who did it needed two things: access to her estate's legal files, and confidence that Estelle would take the blame. Leighton's jaw clenched. Estelle. She poured the tea. She stood to inherit. She had the vulnerability of someone shy, isolated, and easy to accuse. Cordelia was controlling. Yes, but not foolish. If she was moving to cut Crowe out, she would have told someone. Perhaps not Estelle, but maybe her solicitor. There was a long pause. Then Leighton said, You're cleverer than you appear. I make a study of people. She didn't tell me she changed her mind, but I saw it in her tone, her questions. She asked for original contracts, old ledgers, things she never used to bother with. I knew what was coming. So you chose to act first. Leighton stood. His voice remained even, but his fingers tapped once, twice against the desk's mahogany edge. She would have destroyed everything, had me disbarred, swowed, and for what? For being clever with funds she never even noticed had grown. Miss Marple's gaze didn't waver. So you contacted Crowe, warned him, arranged for poison. I never touched the cup. No. But you did hire the new kitchen maid. Quiet girl, untrained, someone easily manipulated, someone who could be distracted or set up to be blamed if questions arose. Leighton said nothing. Miss Marple continued, and you knew Estelle would be the natural suspect. Poor dear. Standing by with a teacup. You counted on that, until Cordelia collapsed too quickly, and the ledger survived. Leighton exhaled slowly. I should have burned it when I had the chance. You had many chances. But murder has no edits. Leighton was arrested before dusk. Constable Rafferty arrived personally, shoulders squared. Leighton didn't struggle. He merely straightened his cuffs and asked for his coat. As he passed Miss Marple by the gate, he paused. You win. She gave a small, sad smile. No one wins in these things, Mr. Leighton. We only prevent a second tragedy. Later that evening, Estelle and Miss Marple sat in the garden of the Dower house. A single lantern flickered between them. The house feels different now, Estelle said, hands around her cup, as if it belongs to someone else. It will, in time, belong to you. I don't want the money. Then give it away. But know the truth first. Estelle nodded slowly. He used me. Yes. But you didn't let him succeed. They sat in silence for a while. Then Estelle said, You knew all along, didn't you, that it wasn't me? That it was never as simple as a girl pouring tea? Miss Marple smiled faintly. My dear, in all my years I've never known guilt to tremble quite like innocence does. Chapter 9. The arrest of Basil Leighton sent a chill through St. Hedwig's that no summer sun could lift. It wasn't only that he'd killed a woman, nor even that he'd done so with calculation. It was that he'd done it with manners, polite, smiling, and entirely as expected. Respectability had cracked. Yet, Miss Marple, as always, remained calm in the storm's wake, because she knew there was still one, because she knew there was still one piece missing. The poison had been prepared. The motive was undeniable, but the precise how the substance had entered Cordelia Everleigh's cup, unseen, unspoken, remained unresolved. Leighton had not been at the tea, and Ivy Kernow, the maid, had seen only nervous movement, nothing concrete. Miss Marple returned to the matter the way she returned to knitting, with patience and memory. And memory, she knew, could be found in one place above all others, in a village like St. Hedwig's, the vicarage. Reverend Silas Merton lived modestly in a whitewashed parsonage, tucked between the churchyard and a line of ash trees. Miss Marple called at 4:30, just as he was preparing his second cup of tea. "Miss Marple," he said, rising awkwardly, "I assume this isn't a spiritual visit." "Not exactly, though clarity often borders on divine." He offered a small, puzzled smile. She accepted her tea, and they sat in the study, a room lined with volumes of theological texts and disused hymnals. Rain spattered faintly at the windows again, soft, rhythmic. "Reverend," she said, "I'd like you to recall the tea party at the Dower House." His brow creased. "A grim day, indeed. But I wonder, do you remember the serving of the tea itself? That much is clear." She was pale, awkward with the cups. "Who passed them around?" "Cordelia handed mine directly. So did Mrs. Hargrave, I believe. Dr. Peake passed his own. And Cordelia's." Reverend Merton paused. He set down his cup carefully. "Actually, I passed it to her." Miss Marple looked up slowly. "You?" "Yes, I was nearest the tray." Estelle poured each cup. Cordelia was distracted, calling to Ivy about something. "I took mine. Then I passed hers." "And you didn't see anything unusual?" He shook his head. "No." "Not a cup switched?" "No." A gesture reaching across, brushing a sleeve. "Something?" He opened his mouth, then closed it again. "What is it, Reverend?" He cleared his throat. "Mrs. Hargrave. She offered sugar to Cordelia. But Cordelia always took her tea unsweetened. I recall that now. She made a point of it. 'Let the leaf speak for itself,' she used to say. And yet Mrs. Hargrave offered it anyway." "Yes." And Cordelia snapped at her, said something like, "I haven't changed my ways overnight." Miss Marple smiled thinly. "But perhaps someone else hoped she had." Mrs. Fiona Hargrave lived in a sprawling house she could no longer afford, filled with bric-a-brac and wilting hydrangeas. She answered the door in a rustling housecoat, eyes sharp behind tinted spectacles. "Miss Marple," she said, not quite warmly, "have you come to gloat? Everyone else seems to be. I've come for a cup of tea, if that's not too forward." Mrs. Hargrave blinked, then stepped aside. "I suppose we all need something to sip while we mourn the downfall of Basil Leighton." In the parlour, as she stirred milk into her own cup, Miss Marple watched her movements, precise, habitual, not the movements of someone newly rattled. "Terrible business," Mrs. Hargrave said. "I never liked Leighton. Too polished. The kind of man who knows the price of lilies, but never how to arrange them. And yet you accepted his help, I believe, in dealing with your late husband's estate." A brief pause. "Once, briefly, Cordelia recommended him." Miss Marple sipped her tea. "You offered her sugar at the garden party?" "Yes." "Reflex, I suppose." She never took sugar. Mrs. Hargrave tilted her head. Are we counting sugar cubes now, Jane? We're counting methods, because poison requires a delivery. Mrs. Hargrave's face hardened. Are you accusing me of something? I'm noting, Miss Marple said gently, that someone dropped something into Cordelia's tea, something she didn't see, because it happened in a moment she was distracted, calling to Ivy about the bees, I believe. Mrs. Hargrave didn't answer. She dismissed Crow, and she was preparing to remove Leighton. But you were never on the ledger, never mentioned in the trust, never named in her will, save for a petty sum tied to a gardening society she disliked. £25, Mrs. Hargrave said, very quietly, after 30 years of friendship, and you believed she owed you more. I helped her through everything. After Thomas died, I came to that house every morning. I organized her affairs when Estelle ran off to Brighton. I screened her callers. I introduced her to Leighton, and she never saw it. Never once did she say thank you. She said thank you, Miss Marple said. She just didn't say please. Continue. Mrs. Hargrave stood abruptly. Is there a reason you came here? To give you a choice, Miss Marple said softly. The police know the poison came from a crushed sedative, and they'll soon know where it was purchased. Mrs. Hargrave stared. Your late husband, Miss Marple went on, used to take them. I remember. You said so yourself once. Enough pills to sink a barge. They believe a bottle went unaccounted for after his death. Mrs. Hargrave's fingers trembled. I didn't mean to kill her, but you did. I only meant to frighten her, confuse her, shake her grip on that estate. Miss Marple rose, taking her gloves gently from the side table. Then, Mrs. Hargrave, I suggest you tell that to someone who writes things down. Chapter 10. The following morning, Mrs. Fiona Hargrave sat alone in the police station's small interview room, hands folded carefully in her lap, as if waiting for tea to be served. Just silence. Tight and final. Constable Rafferty sat across from her, pen poised above his notepad. Miss Marple observed from the corner, her presence neither official nor challenged. Mrs. Hargrave stared at the scratched tabletop. I had no intention to kill her, she said again. You crushed the pills, Rafferty said quietly. Yes, and slipped them into her tea. She inhaled once. No, I slipped them into the sugar, just in her dish. Just a pinch. I thought she might use it. She had, once or twice, in recent weeks. I noticed she was changing. She refused it at tea. I panicked, Mrs. Hargrave said. I offered it aloud, hoping she'd reach for it. She didn't. I offered it aloud, hoping she'd reach for it. She didn't. But Reverend Merton handed her the cup before I could think. So the sedative dissolved anyway. I suppose so. But I never intended it to be lethal. It was only enough to make her light-headed, perhaps stumble, enough for the others to question her health, her mind, enough to make Estelle appear incapable, to raise doubt about her being the heir. You tampered with her drink, Rafferty said flatly. She humiliated me, Mrs. Hargrave whispered. 30 years of service, of biting my tongue, of stitching her name into charity registers and dinner place cards. I was her mirror. So, but she only ever looked at herself. The constable said nothing for a while. Then quietly, you understand, Mrs. Hargrave, that your actions led directly to her death. I do now. Outside, Miss Marple and Rafferty stood beneath a thin, overcast sky. The church bells struck 11. She thought she was clever, Rafferty said. She was clever, Miss Marple replied, just not clever enough to consider that Cordelia might break routine, that she'd see the sugar but not touch it, that the tea, poured by someone else, handed by another, might still carry the poison through a sequence of simple human kindness. She could have come forward. She could have, but shame is a powerful silencer. Rafferty nodded slowly. So that's it then. Leighton planned the cover-up. Crowe handled the finances. And Mrs. Hargrave. Miss Marple folded her hands gently. Cordelia Everleigh died not from a single act, but from layers of betrayal. Grade. Yes, but also vanity, resentment, bitterness that festered just long enough to be fatal. Rafferty was quiet for a long moment. Then, there's going to be a trial. There always is, Miss Marple said. But the truth is already known. It only waits for paper and seal. Later that afternoon, Estelle found Miss Marple in her rose garden. I read the article, she said softly. It's in the Chronicle. They called it The Poisoned Legacy. Poetic, Miss Marple murmured, and only slightly inaccurate. Estelle exhaled, hands clasped. I've been thinking. When Aunt Cordelia died, I was angry, then frightened, then just confused. But now, I think what hurts most is realizing how many people hated her, quietly, carefully, like they'd been preparing for it. People don't hate at once, Miss Marple said. They store it, fold it into routines, until it becomes familiar. Estelle looked down. I don't want the house. Then make it something else. I was thinking of converting it, not selling, not living here either. Something useful, a reading retreat, maybe, or a care center. Something that matters. Miss Marple smiled. That, she said, would be quite a different legacy. That evening, as the sun dipped behind the hedgerows, and the air turned to gold, Miss Marple penned the final entry in her journal. Cordelia Everleigh, age 70, found collapsed at tea. Culprit 1, Henry Crowe, alias Emery Forbes. Fraud. Motive. Pressure. Culprit 2, Basil Leighton. Access. Concealment. Instigator. Culprit 3, Fiona Hargrave. Proximity. Method. Resentment. Not one cause, but 3. Cordelia sensed change, began to reclaim control. Her mistake was assuming manners equated to loyalty. They rarely do. She paused, then added, Estelle Everleigh, clear-eyed, shaken, but intact. She will not repeat the cycle. She closed the journal gently. Outside, the village exhaled its quiet evening breath. Windows glowing, kettles whistling, the day folding into stillness. In the distance, a pair of bees floated near the trellis, hovering where Cordelia's roses once bloomed defiantly. Miss Marple watched them for a moment, then turned down her lamp. Chapter 11. 3 days after Mrs. Hargrave's confession and Basil Leighton's arrest, the village of St. Hedwig settled uneasily back into its routines. Curtains fluttered, church bells tolled, postmen resumed, delivering letters with mundane importance. But in the Dower house, silence lingered. Estelle stood in the morning light, at the base of the staircase, holding something small in her hand, a silver brooch, shaped like a bee. Cordelia's. It had fallen from her aunt's shawl that afternoon, in the garden. Estelle had found it days later, tucked beneath a rosebush root, the silver dulled, almost buried in the earth. She turned it over thoughtfully. It was heavier than it looked. Miss Marple arrived not long after, invited but unannounced. I wasn't sure you'd come, Estelle said softly, leading her through the entry hall. You'll find I'm rather hard to deter, especially when tea is offered. They sat in the sunroom, where ivy pressed against the glass, and the china had been reset on Cordelia's best linen. This time, Estelle poured with confidence. No trembling, no hesitation. I'm glad it's over, she said at last. But it still doesn't feel settled. It rarely does. Justice is often quiet and terribly incomplete. There's something I haven't told the police. Miss Marple didn't speak. She simply waited. Estelle reached into her cardigan pocket and drew out a folded letter, handwritten on familiar lilac stationery. I found it, tucked into the last pages of the ledger, folded so tightly I nearly missed it. Miss Marple opened it with care. Estelle, if I don't make it through this storm, you must know I never doubted your character, only your readiness. I had thought to wait longer before returning what is yours. But I've come to see that waiting is a kind of control I mistook for care. That ends now. If anything happens, ask Jane Marple. She sees what I never wanted to admit. Cordelia. Miss Marple looked up, the letter resting lightly in her lap. She knew. She must have, Estelle said, and she was trying to fix it before it was too late. But others moved faster. Estelle nodded. She wasn't always kind, but she was trying. Miss Marple folded the letter again, more gently than necessary. She left the truth behind. That's rare. Most people die with their better intentions still unspoken. I don't know what to do with it. You already are. What to do with it? You already are. That afternoon, Miss Marple took a slow walk to the cemetery, a small bouquet of rosemary and sage in her hands. Cordelia Everleigh's grave was still fresh, the headstone newly etched. Cordelia Henshaw Everleigh, 1879, 1955. Order is peace. Miss Marple knelt carefully, brushed a fallen leaf from the name, and placed the herbs on the soil. She didn't speak. The quiet was enough. Behind her, footsteps approached. Reverend Merton, his coat flapping faintly in the wind, stopped beside her with a tired sigh. She ruled this village from that garden, he murmured, even when she wasn't present. She understood people's habits better than their hearts, Miss Marple said. That was her flaw, and her safety. Until it wasn't, they stood for a moment more, then turned back toward the lane. Did I do wrong? Reverend Merton asked suddenly. No, but not remembering sooner about the tea, the sugar. You remembered when it mattered, Miss Marple said gently. We are all late to some truths. He nodded once and said no more. Back in her cottage, Miss Marple made her final notes in the small black journal that now held Cordelia's case in full. She numbered the last page. Miss Marple's final reasoning. Dower House inquiry. Cordelia suspected financial manipulation. She began to reassert control over her estate. Leighton and Crowe feared exposure. Mrs. Hargrave, long overlooked, feared exclusion. The poison, a sedative, was introduced via sugar, relying on Cordelia's occasional changes in routine. When the tea was poured by Estelle and passed by the Reverend, the trap was unintentionally sprung. Leighton removed the broken cup, likely attempting to destroy evidence. Estelle's discovery of the ledger accelerated the unravelling. Ivy Kerno's observation proved critical. Emotional motive, resentment, entitlement, fear of exposure. Justice served. 3 actors unmasked. All key documents recovered. Ledger, memorandum, letter, inheritance restored. No unresolved elements remain. Then, quietly, Cordelia Everly was not loved, but she was seen. That may be enough. The next morning, the village bulletin board displayed a new notice: the Dower House Trust for Independent Girls' Education, founded in memory of Cordelia Everly. Opening spring 1956, Miss Marple read it with a small smile. Estelle had found a use for the house after all, and at last, something planted there would grow without fear. Chapter 12. Spring came early to St. Hedwig's Sea. By March, crocuses had broken through the soil around the base of the Dower House. The stone walls, once rigid with ivy and cold governance, now echoed with soft laughter. Girls practicing recitations in the drawing room, music lessons drifting from the old library, Estelle's voice calmly calling attendants down the front hall. The Dower House Trust had opened its doors to 15 young women, clever, restless, undervalued. Cordelia's will, amended before her death, had specified its intent: education, autonomy, and no deference to family name or fortune. Miss Marple visited on a Tuesday morning. Estelle met her at the door, apron dusted with chalk and a paint smudge on her sleeve. "We're repurposing the solarium as an art studio," she said, leading Miss Marple inside. "I think Cordelia would have hated it." "Then you've made the perfect choice." They walked through what was once Cordelia's domain: parlor, conservatory, garden, and Miss Marple was quietly struck by what had not changed: the wallpaper, the rugs, even the faint scent of verbena. But the air was different, lighter, unwatched. They reached the old ledger room, now turned into a modest classroom. Estelle lifted a linen-covered box from the cupboard and placed it on the desk. "You asked what I'd do with the past," she said. "I decided not to erase it." Inside the box lay the ledger, Cordelia's final letter, the silver bee brooch, and a photograph of the Dower House, taken in 1921. 4 women stood on the steps: Cordelia, her younger sister Emily, a governess, and a girl no one in the village had remembered until now: Estelle's mother. "You were right," Estelle said. "My mother worked here for years." Cordelia knew. That's why she watched me so closely. Not for fear but guilt. Miss Marple traced the photo's edge. She raised walls around her regrets. "You've chosen not to." Estelle nodded. "I want these girls to live in a house where no one is afraid to speak." "A bold ambition," Miss Marple said, smiling, "and a rare one." Later that day, Miss Marple strolled through the village. At the baker's, she bought a half-loaf of plum bread. At the greengrocer's, she paused to speak with Ivy Kernow, who now wore a proud little hat and held her chin higher than she had in months. "You were right about the cup," Miss Marple told her quietly. "Cordelia's didn't break by accident. I didn't want it to be true. It often isn't." From there she stopped at the church. Reverend Merton was pruning back the roses near the lych gate. "No sermon today?" she asked. "Only for the thorns," he said, brushing soil from his hands. "They seem more forgiving." They shared a brief, companionable silence. "You've done a kindness," he said finally, "to the village and to me." "I only followed the shadows," Miss Marple said. Cordelia did the rest. That evening, back at her cottage, Miss Marple wrote one final entry in her black journal. Miss Marple's reflections. Dower House final villages do not change because one woman dies, but they shift inch by inch when another woman chooses not to inherit the fear. Cordelia Everleigh sowed control and died isolated. Estelle Allen sowed trust and opened the garden gates. The murder was solved, the truth unearthed, and something fragile has taken root in its place. Let it grow. She closed the journal gently, placed it on the shelf between the case of the blue geranium and the affair at the bungalow. Then, as twilight softened the edges of the world outside her window, Miss Marple lit a single lamp, poured herself a cup of plain tea, no sugar, and opened a new book. The house was quiet, and at long last, so was the Dower House.